Welcome to adding new script languages to Godot. I'm your host. My name's Jeff Ward. I'm a senior software engineer at Datadog. Datadog is an observability company. We mostly work in server backends, doing logs, application performance monitoring, and real user monitoring. Real user monitoring is my specialty. I make SDKs for Flutter and Unity, as well as our game expansions. But I'm not here to talk about any of that. If you do want to talk about observability, you can catch me after. Here I'm talking about what I do in my spare time. I am a crazy person. I like embedding languages into other things. And I work on Godot Dart. I embed Dart into Godot so that you can use Dart as a scripting language for Godot. I am fully aware the Godart pun was there and I missed it. I'm sorry. So why would you do this? Well, because GDScript is great. Like, it has all of the syntactic sugar for node path access. It has onReady, which is a great way to get all of your stuff bound to the Godot script. It has @preload, which allows you to preload resources. And GDScript is always the first-class citizen for Godot. It's always going to be the first thing to gain new features. So why add a different language? Well, because I really like working with Dart. I really like the language. I find it's a really nice kind of middle ground between being very expressive and very safe, and it's very fun to work with. And I have a feeling if you are here, there is a language that you really like working with and you want to work with it in Godot. And I think that the more flexible that we can make Godot, the better it's going to be. The more ways that people can come to Godot and start using it without having to learn GDScript, they can come with the language they know and the languages they love, the better Godot is going to be. So as a starting point, where we're going to start is I'm going to have to assume you know a few things. The first thing I am going to assume you know is you have a basic understanding of what GDExtension is and what it does. I will go over some nitty-gritty details of GDExtension as it relates to adding scripting languages, but I do need you to understand GDExtension a little bit. The second thing I need you to know is how you can initialize your language's runtime. I'm not going to be going over how to do a lot of this stuff, even as it relates to Dart, so you need to have an understanding of how your language works from an embedding perspective. And then I also need you to know how to access C and FFI functions from your language. Either by, in old Dart, this was done through message calls back to the Dart runtime. Now they have FFI. Whatever your language does, you need to understand how to do that. So I won't be going over it. So starting with GDExtension. GDExtension is going to be how you'll load your extension and initialize your language's runtime. It's also how you're going to call from your language back into Godot. And so I have a few suggested first steps when you're looking to work with a new language in Godot. First, figure out how to initialize your language from GDExtension. You'll get a call from GDExtension saying, please initialize. You need to initialize your language from there. Then, figure out how to call a method in your language from your GDExtension. This can be as simple as just calling a hello world method. Then, figure out how to call a method from Godot, from your language into Godot using GDExtension, and then use the extension API.json to generate everything else. So this may feel like a draw the rest of the owl, but this is what you really want to do. The good thing is there are actually a lot of examples of how to do GDExtension API language generation from all of these, which are not script languages, they're extension languages. But they all have really good examples of how to do a lot of that binding. And these can be the languages that are like become the basis for how you're going to start doing your embedding. For example, Dart uses Godot CPP to do a lot of its bindings before they get to Dart. But there are a few key areas of GDExtension that I want to go over before we move into script language. The first is I want to talk a little bit about object types. Then I want to talk about extension instance bindings, and then I want to talk a little bit about how you call functions from GDExtension. So there are two major types of object in Godot. The first are built-ins. These are all things that are assigned to variant. They have their own memory, and they're kind of like C# structs. They're usually copied, and accessing their properties is mostly just about reading memory in and out. The built-ins have their own methods, their own GDExtension methods for construction, destruction, referencing, dereferencing, and calling all of their methods. But the main thing to know is that if you have one of these in your script language, you need to be able to allocate the memory for it and copy it in and out. Then there are engine classes. This is basically everything else. Everything inherits from object. These are pointers. They're passed by reference. Some of them are reference counted, if you were Miguel's talk earlier, talking about reference counted objects versus nodes. Some of them are reference counted, some aren't. They're all constructed by class DB. There's a thing in Godot called class DB that holds all the definitions for all of the classes that Godot has, and all of them get constructed by class DB. These have their own methods in GDExtension for calling methods on them, accessing their properties, etc. The main thing to know here is that when you're creating built-ins versus engine classes, for built-ins, you allocate your memory for them, and then you call the correct constructor. And for engine classes, you're going to ask class DB to create that instance for you, and then you're going to tie the version it hands back to you to your language's versions of the engine via an instance binding. What this looks like in practice, this is Dart code. It's not super important to know Dart. The main thing to know is when in here we call it an opaque pointer. When we create any built-in, we're going to allocate an opaque pointer, which is just a bunch of memory. And then we're going to hand that back to the superclass, which is then going to call the constructor. On a extension type, which is everything that inherits from object, we're going to ask the class DB, here called GDE, to construct the object using the native type name that we want. And then we're going to call tie Dart to native. And that's the thing that actually ties the instance binding to the class in the background. So I've talked a little bit about Godot instance bindings. If you're not aware of what instance bindings are, is every Godot object is holding on to it a binding to all of the different extensions that are loaded so that the extension can keep its own copy and its own representation of that object. And it's basically a hash table between the extension and the extension's instance of the object. Each Godot object has a map of extensions to instance bindings, and you get them with object and get instance binding. And this includes if you haven't created one yet, because if you haven't created one, you'll get a callback saying, hey, I don't have a representation for your extension for this object. You need to create me one and give it back to me. But if you need to create a representation of an object in your language, in Dart, this is a Dart handle, to the Godot version, the extension instance binding is how you're going to do that. So you keep your version of the object in the extension instance binding, and Godot has its version of the object as a pointer. When you're calling functions on a Godot object, you get your method bindings with class DB get method bind. And then there are two methods once you have the method bind to call them. The first one is going to be object method bind call. Here, all the parameters are variants. So they all are they're all of the same type, but as a result, it's much easier to implement. Put everything to a variant, put it in an array, pass it to object method bind call, and you're good. The problem is it's slow to create variants. And it's slower because of all the copy constructors and conversions, and that has to happen both on your side when you create the variants, and then on the other side, it's going to pull everything out of the variants in order to call the actual function. The second version, which is a little bit newer to Godot, is object method bind pointer call. All the parameters here are pointers to their arguments. It's an array of pointers. All of the arguments are pointers to their arguments. This is much faster because no conversion needs to happen so long as all your pointers are correct, but it's also potentially unsafe. If you mess up and put your parameters in wrong, your program will crash. Ask me how I know. In Dart, we actually do use pointer calls. We allocate, up at the top, we allocate an array of pointers. We put all the pointers in the correct locations, and then we call object method bind pointer call. So now we get to the point of this talk, which is scripts. So what is a script in Godot? It's a resource. See, it says it right there. Script inherits from resource, but what does that mean in practice? Is that it's a file. A resource is attached to a node the same way a texture would be attached to a node. The script is then instanced on an object when it's created, and methods are called on it. Okay? So the main thing to know here is that scripts in Godot are not bindings from an object to a type in your language. They are bindings from an object to a file. If anybody uses C# in Godot, they know that there's a restriction that you can only have one type per file. This is why. If your language supports doing multiple types in a single file, you need to figure out a way to create a mapping between the file name that Godot is going to ask you for and the type. But there are a few key classes. Each of these key classes that you're going to be working with when creating a script language are extension classes. They are registered to class CB. They are not scripts. In Dart, we create all of these in C#, and then we register those to the class CB with C++'s register class. So there are 4 parts we need to go over. The first one is the resource loader. Then we'll talk about the script extension class. We'll talk about script instances, and then we're going to talk about the script language extension. Resource loader, like I said, scripts in Godot are files. So you need to tell Godot how to load these files, even though they're just text. And so you have a resource format loader and a resource format saver. You need to implement both of these and register them to Godot properly. Resource format loader has a few methods on it. It's actually a fairly simple class. The 3 main ones you really need to be paying attention to are handles type, which is called to say, hey, do you know how to load this thing? And you say, if it's a script, you say, yep, I know how to load this thing. The second one is get resource script class, which is asking, hey, what's the script class for this? And you just hand back a string saying, in my case, Dart script. And then the last one is load, which is the actual thing that will give you the file that you need to load and load it up. One of the reasons to implement load, even if you're working in a language where like the file is not going to be your base point, is that's how it's going to be usable in the IDE. So you can look at it in the IDE. Resource format saver is basically very similar. The main method here is save. When you hit Control-S, if you're looking at a script file in the Godot editor, it will save that file out to disk, so you probably should implement it. Script extensions. So script extension is a bigger class, but script extension extends script. There's a lot of methods here. I wouldn't worry about too much of them. The main ones to really pay attention to are get source code, set source code. Once you load your file, you should set the source code because that's what, again, the IDE is going to look for. Using get source code and set source code when you load it up. Instance create is how you're going to create script instances. Placeholder instance create is going to be how you create placeholder instances. And get language is going to return your script language extension. But those are kind of the main functions. Everything else is really about introspection, finding out what methods, what properties are on this script. But script instance, this is where a lot of the actual functionality is going to exist. There is no base class for this. You're not extending any base classes. They're defined by a struct of function pointers. And it's going to do most of your heavy lifting. So like I said, in Godot object, you have an extension instance binding, which is a mapping of extension to the extension representation. There's also a script instance and script instance info on every single Godot object. And this works basically the same way, except there's only one. So when you have a node, you bind a script to it. It will then say, from then on, when you call a function on that object, the first thing it's going to check is, does that method exist on the script instance? And if it does, I'm going to call it on the script instead. So how does this work? B prepares for programmer art. So over here we have Godot, what Godot is going to do. And then on the other side, we're going to have your GDExtension and what your GDExtension is going to do. So when you load a scene, the first thing Godot is going to see, it's going to see, well, I have a file here that's a script that's defined in the GDExtension, and it's going to call load on your resource format loader. Your resource format loader is then going to create your script extension and then hand it back. Sometime in the future, now that it has your script extension, Godot is going to create the object that has the script bound to it, and then it's going to ask the script extension, please create me an instance of this script, which then you're going to create a script instance, which is some pointer or some handle or something in your language, which is the thing that you need to be able to make the connection. You're then going to call this function in GDExtension called script instance create 3. The only reason it's called instance create 3 is because it's the third version of this function. This is just convention in GDExtension in order to keep backwards compatibility. Whenever we need to make a change to the signature of one of these functions, we just append a number. You could call 2 as well, it'll still work. And then you hand that object, and once you've created that object, you're going to hand that back to that'll get handed back to the object as your script instance extension. Script instance info is all of this stuff. Again, there's a lot of this. But these are all function pointers. And each one is going to pass you back the script instance that you created. So every time one of these functions gets called, it's going to pass you back whatever you told it was the script instance. And most of these functions revolve around introspection, getting methods, getting properties. But some of them, some are for method calls and properties and getters and setters. But some revolve around memory management. Ref count incremented, decremented, and object freed. Yeah, free func. The introspection functions, Godot will ask you about the methods, signals, and properties on your class. And if they change, you need to notify that Godot has done this. I think this happens through notify property list changed, but I've been having trouble getting this to work, so that might not be the right one. But if you have a statically typed language, like I do, without any runtime introspection, this can be super difficult. So what Dart does is it generates the code for all of this rather than rely on its mirrors and introspection. So this is what it looks like. So we generate all of this type information, which includes the base class that it's inheriting from, whether or not it's a global class, its parent type. It has a whole bunch of information about what methods it implements, as well as what properties it implements, et cetera. And then function calls to script instances. You have these two functions on script instances, get method list func and free method list func, which are going to get the method lists and the property lists. Interestingly, this is mostly for the editor because it doesn't matter. You're still going to get, even though it has a list of methods, you're still going to get a call to has method func every time it wants to, well, not every time, the first time it wants to call the method to see if it's there. So it's very important that you implement that. Has method is giving your script instance and a name of a script to see if it's available. And then once it says, yep, that's a function I have on me, it will do a call giving your script instance a name, a list of arguments and variants. Scripts don't support pointer calls. Every single time you're called a function, it's going to be a list of variants that you then have to convert if you want to convert them to native types in your script. Another thing to note is that update functions, by design, are always called from the editor. And so if you have logic in your nodes that does things like animate them, they're going to do that, even if they're only supposed to be game only. To get around this, when the editor creates something, we'll call placeholder instance create. There's no difference between a placeholder instance and a regular instance, except for the fact that it calls placeholder instance create versus instance create. We store this as a flag saying whether or not it's a placeholder, and if it's a placeholder for every method call, even if we have that method, we return GDExtension call error invalid method. That stops all the updates. Ask me how long that took to figure out. It's like, why is it rotating? Okay, script language. There's another class called script language extension. It's really freaking long. There's a lot here. Good news. It's mostly about interacting with the editor. There's not a lot in here that's actually specific about getting your script language to work. So unless you want full editor support, including like tab completion, debugging, error lists, all that stuff, you actually don't have to implement that. In fact, Godot Dart doesn't implement most of any of it except for syntax highlighting, because I just haven't figured out a way to get it all to work. So it's not as important to fill all this stuff out, so long as you have some functions that kind of return 0 in most of the cases. There are some caveats to that. There are two handles global class type and get global class name. This is for support for Dart global classes. If you're not aware, Dart global classes are these guys they appear in the node, create node editor. They have the little icon on them that says that they're scripts. But they don't really offer that much over class DB classes because they're defined by scripts, but they have all the performance negatives of scripts, but none of the benefits of like how they're created. If you create an extension class type and register it to class DB, you're probably going to get better performance and a bunch of other stuff. I still use them because I find them slightly easier to use, but extension class types work just as well. So if you're already supporting GDExtension, you can use the class DB classes just fine for global class types. So, quick note about memory when you're working with a script language in Godot. Ref counted objects and garbage collectors don't like each other. Really don't. Both instance binding and script instances will tell you when an object is destroyed. So when a node's destroyed, you get a callback that says, hey, I freed this object. You need to do something about that. In Dart, we just disconnected. This is what Miguel was talking about with Swift. You do the disconnection. If anybody attempts to call anything from then on, you throw an exception. In Dart, we just ignore it. We just kind of like, yeah, no, that was gone. I don't know why you're doing anything with that. But ref counted objects are a little bit more difficult. When the ref count on an object is changed, you do get a callback from Godot, but only for if the reference count is below or equal to 2. This is a performance thing because above that, it kind of doesn't matter. You have enough, like there's more references that you need to care about. But at 2 and at 1 and at 0, these are the callbacks that are actually responsible. So, but you're responsible for holding references properly in your language if they're ref counted. If you do not, your GC might collect your instance binding out from under you. And Godot will still be holding on to that instance binding and it will try to call it and crash. The alternative is the GC doesn't collect it properly and your reference counted objects leak. So how do you get around this? This is Dart's process. I copied it from the C# module, which does much the same thing. Here's a nice flow diagram. This is actually up in the Godot Dart repo now to kind of go through what it's doing. But the main thing to understand is the Dart runtime is always holding on to a strong reference if Godot has a strong reference. So it always has the first reference count. And this prevents a GC from Dart because the bindings are holding on to a strong reference to that ref counted object. Once the reference count hits 1, meaning Dart is the only thing holding on to this anymore, Dart changes its internal reference to weak. And that means the Dart GC can come around and garbage collect that object, decrement the count by exactly 1, and that ref counted object is now gone. So, I know that was a whirlwind, but that's most of what you need to know to actually get started writing a script extension. And what are the issues with doing this? Well, the first one is communication with other GDExtensions and add-ons. There's no simple way to do this yet. There's no way to generate the bindings against them because they don't necessarily register to class DB in time for you to create a JSON that you can kind of generate against them. So the add-on code needs to be written manually. So for example, I'm using NetFox in my game. I look for singletons that are auto loads, and then I wrap them, and then I call them with string-typed functions, and I try to make sure everything works. And then you get into situations like I did recently where I was trying to call a function, it wasn't working, and it turned out I had the wrong version of NetFox. Like, there was no way to know. It was very difficult for me to figure out why that was happening. The second thing is support for GDScript features. Some things just aren't supported. GDScript supports a whole lot of features that aren't advertised to GDExtension. App preload is one of them. This is done through analysis of the GDScript file, and it does preloads itself, and we have no way to access that yet. So C# also doesn't support this. That said, some stuff just works. RPC works. You can register RPC functions through GDExtension just fine, and we do in Godot Dart. Excuse me. Next is IDE support. Source modification in Godot assumes anytime you want to add new functions. So when you go into Signal and say, create this signal for me, or create this connection for me, it assumes that whatever template you send back to it goes to the end of the file. This is great for GDScript, because that's correct. But for C# and Dart, which are classes that have to put things above this curly brace, it's wrong, and it's unfortunate. And hopefully at some point we'll think of a way to fix that. But it's also difficult to get to work with language servers. So GDScript, almost all of its functions are not async, and neither are its debugging functions. So if you need to asynchronously communicate with a language server to say, hey, what are the errors in this file, there's no good way to do that. You have to communicate with it in a background thread, and then just when Godot asks you, you say, well, here's the most recent information that I have. And the last issue with documentation is documentation, and by that I mean there isn't any. This is for, I forget which, I think this might be language. There's just no documentation for any of the extensions right now. But I'm gonna actually start working on fixing that. So through a lot of my work here, I've started to understand how a lot of this stuff works. And I'm gonna start trying to add some of this documentation as I go, as I remember to do so. And hopefully if you start doing this, you can start adding some too, which would be great. And that's all I really have. I know that's like really fast, quick whirlwind through Dart script extensions, but who has questions? I'm sure there are some.
How's performance with the language?
I have no idea. I actually put that down in the Godot repo. I have a whole section on performance. And my answer there is I haven't taken the time to optimize anything, so I can't comment on the performance yet.
Okay, so it doesn't really use the language's performance as much.
It can. So there's some performance. So there's some performance things that have been done with C# that show in certain circumstances C# performs better than GDScript, and in certain circumstances GDScript is going to perform better than C#. I think what it's going to come down to more than anything is the number of thunks you have, which is the number of transitions between your language and Godot. Yeah. The fewer of those that you have, the more you're going to have your language's performance take over, and the more of them you have, the more that things like variant conversions are going to cause you significant issues.
Gotcha. And do you have to embed the runtime of your language into your Godot, I guess, whenever you publish your game?
Yes.
Okay.
It depends on I will say it depends on the language.
Okay.
So some languages, when they compile, they'll compile a standalone machine code with the VM embedded in it, and then you don't have to. Then it ships that way.
So like Golang.
Yeah. With Dart, yes, I would have to send. I would have to give the libdart stuff, and it would have to be a DLL.
Got it. Thank
you.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned not being able to do function pointer calls at some point, and you instead have to use the variant list.
You can always make pointer calls from your language into Godot. Whenever Godot calls a script function, a script extension, it will always use variant call.
Okay.
It will always use variant call.
On that same note, is there anything that you wish would have been different from the nature of the bindings that Godot provides for you to make this easier?
Oh yeah. Lots of things, but I think starting from GDExtension, so when I started doing this, I started from making Dart a GDExtension language. Starting there is a good first step because you'll run into a lot of the problems here. The memory stuff is the biggest problem, and I just let it leak forever. I just held on to everything strong until I went and was like, I bet you this is leaking like crazy, and it was. Yeah, I think the GDExtension team has actually done a really, really, really good job in making it something that's usable pretty much across the board. I think there's still places to improve, as I kind of pointed out. One of the weird ones that I understand why this is done this way, but some of the stuff when you're asked for functions, like the properties and the functions through introspection, what you are given is a dictionary to fill in, and you just have to know the properties that go in that dictionary in order for it to work. And how did I figure out what those properties were? I looked at the Godot code and figured out what the properties were, and I filled them in properly. And that's some of the documentation stuff.
If you can share, how is Datadog planning to use this?
Oh, we're not. No. Datadog does. Datadog is expanding into game observability, and we have a Unity plugin. We don't have a Godot one, but if you want one, let me know, and I will bring that back to my product owner. But Datadog doesn't use this. This is my personal spare time projects.
One way I've heard leveraged against Godot is that it's really easy to reverse engineer and unpack the game and steal source code. Does this give you any mechanisms to potentially hide your source code?
Depending on what the language is. So Dart, you can run the obfuscator, and then yes. And the same thing with C#, or if you have a language that can obfuscate itself, then yes. Because I didn't show it here, but in the way that we map the file name to the type is just literally I generate for every single file, this is the type that you're going to create. And so if you obfuscate, all of those types are now obfuscated and you can't look at them. So it's language dependent.
This is perhaps a pipe dream and or a nonsensical question, but does it support the at tool?
What's that?
The at tool?
You could make it support @tool. And the reason I say that is because @tool is really just, if I remember correctly, @tool in Godot is just a thing that's saying don't use placeholder instances and instead create this as a full-on script object. So it's like I said, like with placeholder instances, you're basically saying don't do any of the logic for this class. And @tool does the opposite. Essentially, it's like reversing whether or not the functions should be called. Yeah.
I haven't really poked into extensions much, so this might be obvious. But you talked about scripting languages versus the non-scripting one, for instance, like GDExtension and Swift and such. Would it be possible to use the scripting system for a just-in-time style compiled language?
Yeah, Dart's a JITed language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about Dart generally is its ability to do hot reload. So one of the things is like I can be editing my Dart code and adding properties and doing all this other stuff, save it, and then jump over to Godot and everything's automatically reflected. It also supports hot reload at runtime. So if I'm debugging my game and modify the Dart code, I hit save and it's automatically modified in my game. Dart's really cool. There are other languages that support that, by the way. Dart's not the only one, but Dart's really fast about it. Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious in general, these other languages for Godot, have they received much adoption? Do you get the sense that there's a lot of momentum around these projects? Or?
I think it depends. So Swift Godot does, for sure. And I think I've heard some rumblings that the Rust one does as well. But you can't really use them as script languages. And I'm not sure you would want to use Swift or Rust as script languages because of the compiled nature of them, right? You really don't want the scripts, that's just a pain in the butt. You could do it, and I think there are people looking into that. There's even C++ as a script language for Godot that has hot reload. I don't know how they did that, but it's a thing. But you're seeing a few other script extensions that are specific to scripts. Lua already has one. It's probably the most mature of the ones that I know of. And then, Dart works, but it mostly works. I understand. I'm one of the few people that's you know what? We should use Dart for this. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
This is probably a huge and separate bucket, but how hard is it to get Dart working in graphically in the editor where GDScript is typically edited? Presumably you're off in a different IDE.
I'm usually off in a different IDE, and that's actually this set of problems. It would be incredibly difficult. It's not impossible. Dart has a language server that you can boot up, and then I could go in and look at VS Code's the extension and how it operates with the Dart language server, and get all of that stuff working. But I would have to all of those functions that I showed in Dart script extension, Dart language extension. You have to implement all of them, and getting the debugger to work and talking asynchronously to a language server and talking asynchronous to DDS, which is the Dart debugging service, the Dart dev service, would be very difficult. Could you do it? Absolutely. 100% you can do it. I think Godot, if we want to have lots of different script languages that all are supported in the Godot IDE, some of this stuff might have to be rethought to better support asynchronous language servers and languages that aren't GDScript. Yeah.
Are you still able to modify the files even if there's no
Yeah.
IP support?
Yep. Oh yeah, and in Godot, in the Godot editor, if you just don't return anything for things like, it'll ask you like, hey, what's the tab completion for this? And if you're just like, I don't have any, it ignores it. So like occasionally, the one thing I will say is you have to be a little bit careful. One of the things that some people don't like about Dart, especially Dart format, that I love, it's incredibly opinionated. The Dart formatter has no options, zero, none. You either like the way it formats your code or you don't. Don't give me any options. They added one at the behest of most of the community, which is now you can have more than 80 characters per line. This was a huge flame war in the Dart community for a long time.
I love opinionated, but that is hardcore.
Oh, it's super hardcore. But they changed it now, it's configurable. But like, it's going to format your code how it wants to format your code. And I constantly ran into issues where if I saved from the Godot IDE, or the Godot IDE was like, I want to load this in a particular way, it would completely mess up the formatting. And like Dart would freak the fuck out. I think there was there someone back there who had any questions? Nope, okay. Did you have a question? Anyone else? Yeah, if you have any questions about anything else, the Godot Dart repo is open. I tend to be actually pretty good about my commit messages. And I'm more than happy to talk at length about embedding scripting languages into other languages. Thank you.